Honorable Dean Professor Toko Santoso, Honorable Professor Henk Kummeling, and Mr. Isal, and also Honorable Constitutional Law Lecturer from Fakulty of Law, Universitas of Indonesia. Alhamdulillah, this morning we are grateful that we have we'll have a general lecture from one of the reputable scholars in Netherlands and Europe, Professor Henk Kummeling. He is the Professor of Constitutional Law and Comparative Constitutional Law at the University of Constitutional and Administrative Law of the Utrecht University. And then he is also the former chairman of the Dutch Electoral Council in Netherlands. So this is actually the second year that we are inviting him to give us a lecture in the University of Indonesia. And first of all, I want to thank our Dean, Professor Toko Santoso, that giving us full support for make it happen. And that we can applause for our Dean. And second of all, I also want to thank to Constitutional Court Republic of Indonesia for letting us using the video conference facility that this class, this lecturing session will be live online using the video conference to more than 34 universities around Indonesia. So thank you very much for the Constitutional Court. First of all, we would like to hear welcoming address from our Dean, Professor Toko Santoso, and maybe the time is yours.
Terima kasih, Mbak Ayu. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi. It is our great pleasure to have Professor Henk Kummeling here again in UI. Welcome, Prof. This is, as Ayu mentioned, that the second time Professor Henk Kummeling visit us, and he will give a very interesting course on elections. Prof. Henk Kummeling is former chairperson of KPU from Netherlands, the KPU, Election Commission of the Netherlands, and he also very well-known expert on constitutional law in Netherlands. So please use this opportunity to hear his knowledge and experience, and please don't be hesitant to raise your question. Jadi adik-adik semua, tolong manfaatkan kesempatan kehadiran Prof. Henk Kummeling di UI ini untuk sebanyak-banyak menggali pemikiran beliau mengenai pemilihan umum di Belanda, dan juga mungkin beliau juga ahli mengenai comparative election, comparative constitutional law di Belanda. Kita bersyukur Prof. Henk Kummeling bisa tahun ini hadir kembali, dan mudah-mudahan I hope that this is not the last of your visit, but we hope in the future Prof. Henk Kummeling can come again. Okay, please give applause to Prof. Henk Kummeling.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Good morning to you all. First of all, I want to thank your Dean, Toko Santoso, once again for inviting me to UI campus and to deliver a series of lectures, mainly on electoral law, but also in general issues on constitutional law. And this lecture, or today's lecture, will be about the principles for elections in constitutional law, and the organizing committee invited me to give my thoughts on this issue. I was already briefly introduced by my colleague what I'm doing. I'm also, what has been said, I'm a professor of constitutional law in Utrecht, and I teach also in South Africa at the University of the Western Cape. Was already been mentioned, and the dean was quite right that he said that I was the chair of the KPU in the Netherlands, because the Electoral Council in the Netherlands is quite similar to some extent to what the KPU does in the Netherlands, in Indonesia. The Electoral Council is responsible for organizing all national elections and also all referenda. And I was chair until the 1st of January of this year, and I've been chair of the Dutch KPU, so to say, for 12 years. The government made sure that I didn't get bored after my resigning of the KPU. So they appointed me as chair of the committee that does the evaluation of the change of our legislation on the organization of the judiciary and the prosecution's office. So nowadays, a lot of my days, a lot of my hours go to looking at the quality of our judiciary and the work they do. And I'm the chair of the Constitutional Law Association in the Netherlands, which has also a lot of branches in Europe. The topics I'm going to deal with today are following. First of all, I will tell something about the constitutional principles in general. Then I will focus a little bit on one of these constitutional principles, which is the equal political rights, access to equal political rights. Then I turn to the core principles for elections, and I will say then, but I will say it already now, these are only the core principles and you have to implement them in law, and this is a very important issue which I will deal about. And then there are a lot of questions, of course, related to the core principles. It is all about constitutional design, electoral design. How do you implement these core principles in your own constitutional, in your own legal system? And there are a lot of decisions to be made. Then I will briefly turn to the guiding principles of EDR. And EDR stands for Electoral Dispute Resolution. And as I understand correctly, it's all over the world, but also in Indonesia. There are very often a lot of electoral disputes. And I will and I will end with classification of these systems. It's simply, a bridge to what I'm going to do next week, because next week my lecture for the undergraduate students will be about, indeed, entirely about electoral dispute resolution. And of course, at the end of my lecture, I will be happy to answer all the questions you might have. The constitutional principles in general. You could say that these constitutional principles are, to some extent, international and universal. Every modern democracy, every state where the rule of law applies, adheres to these constitutional principles. And I'm sure that you are familiar with them as well. First of all, important constitutional principle is, of course, the rule of law. It's the people that are sovereign, and their will is expressed through law, and especially through the Constitution, which is a very important thing. All power comes, all power derives from the people. It's the people that provides legitimacy to all authorities, all institutions, all governmental bodies, etc., etc. So the rule of law is a very important issue as a constitutional principle. Then the second one is that of limited government. The main function of the Constitution is that it imposes limits on the power of the government, and that it divides that power along different levels, but also different branches. Different levels, of course. You have decentralized levels, like you have here also in Indonesia, municipal levels or provincial levels. These are also a division of power, and indeed they have some powers as well, and not only in the central capital, central bodies. And you divide power among different branches of government, and then I refer, of course, to the legislative bodies, the executive bodies, government, and judiciary. The third core constitutional principle is, of course, that of fundamental rights. There have to be fundamental rights in a constitutional framework. Fundamental rights, you can find them also in different terms, like human rights or principal rights or something like that, but in general we talk about fundamental rights. And that means that every individual has inalienable rights that can, that government is bound to respect. And everyone has it. A very important thing within the constitutional framework is, of course, that a series of these fundamental rights are equal political rights. And that means that everyone, each and every citizen, has the right to participate in government, to stand for elections, and also an equal right to vote. But also there are special political rights like the freedom of expression, the freedom of association, the right to demonstrate. These are also core elements in a constitutional state which adheres to the rule of law and democracy. And there is also this rule of all this principle that says that there is a majority rule. And majority rule means that the decision making in representative bodies is in the end decided by the majority. In the end decided by the majority. It takes a long process, and I will talk about that later, but there's a very important feature of a constitutional principle. And also very important is the separation of church and state. Law reflects the will of the people and not the presumed will of God. That does not mean that there will be no religion and that religion is not allowed in state affairs, but when it comes to the end of it, the law reflects the will of the people. And this core principle of constitutional law also makes it possible to create a peaceful coexistence of people of different religious beliefs within the state. Otherwise there will be always peace, always riots and uproar, etc. And then the final core principle of constitutional principle is that of national independence and the limited authority of international law. The people as such are sovereign, as already said, are independent, and are not subject to any foreign power. That's an important thing. But, of course, the representatives of people have the power to abrogate treaties, sign treaties, or other forms of international law. But, indeed, that does not mean that the fact that there is a core principle stating that there is national independence and a limited authority of international law, that there can't be any powerful regional or international body. Of course, there can be. These bodies can be there. But the main thing is that it's all up to the will of the nation itself, whether or not it wants to participate in that regional body, in that international body. And of course you can have a lot of debate on the importance of international law and just Covenants and all these international things. But from a constitutional point of view, this is a very important feature when it comes to constitutional principles. There are some more, perhaps, in some cases, but in many cases, these other principles are more, one could say, the detailed elements of what these 6 principles are all about. I think these are the main ones. Then one of these core principles, of course, as said already, is equal political rights. And just briefly, I will put some general remarks there. Political rights are very important, of course, are of the utmost importance within a democracy. But you must be well aware of the fact that political rights are subject to limitations. There is a possibility that there are limitations there. But they have to be provided by law, with all kinds of legal aims. Mostly, in many cases, these aims are stated in the Constitution itself, or in special legislation. And for instance, in many cases, when it comes to the freedom of association or the freedom of demonstration, there's a legal aim to limit such a demonstration. When there is a severe threat when it comes to the maintenance of public order and security. But you have to be very clear about that. Limitations are possible, but they have to be proportional. They cannot go any further than is necessary for the aim that you are striving for. And this might seem very simple, and you've heard as undergraduate students already something about that. But this is a very important and very complicated thing. These political rights cause all kinds of complicated, delicate cases. And it might seem awkward, but I'm sure that I'm right when I say that thousands of legal scholars on a day-to-day basis and hundreds of courts, especially constitutional courts, are dealing with these issues because they are so complicated, because they are so delicate, but also because they are so important within a democratic state. One other thing that I already mentioned was that there is a majority rule as a constitutional principle. But majority rule does not mean majoritarian dictatorship. Within a constitution, within a constitutional framework where the democracy and rule of law are predominant, there are also rights for minorities, of course. Minorities have to be treated as equal. They have rights, they do have political rights. And you can't say simply in such a state, well, we have the majority, we decide. You have to take into account the rights and the positions of minorities as well. And you have to keep in your mind, of course, that all these minorities, by forming coalitions, you create a majority one day. And then you're the minority. And we consider yourself, well, how do you want to be treated then? So within a constitutional framework where rule of law exists, you have to be very careful also with the rights of minorities. And that also goes for instance, the position of the opposition parties in parliament. They also have the right to speak. They also have the right to talk about the budget. They also have a possibility to debate all kinds of issues of the government. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of states in the world where the minority in parliament has nothing to say whatsoever. Then I go to the core principles for elections. And I'm sure that you're already familiar with them, so I'll have some problems later on. One of the most important things is, of course, that all elections should be universal, which means that all human beings are allowed to participate in elections. And there may be no exception. No exception when it comes to, for instance, race or sex, male, female. And in many countries, in decades ago, there was made a difference whether or not you paid taxes or not. Only people that pay taxes could participate in elections. Or in the United States, in the southern states, for instance, only people that could write could participate in elections. This is not in conformity with the core principles of elections. All human beings have to be allowed to participate in elections. You can make exceptions, of course. You are not obliged to let babies participate in elections or mentally disabled. And you can make some kind of exceptions, for instance, on national residence, whether or not you live in the country or not. We'll see something more about that later on. But in general, you would say all human beings are, have access to elections. Elections have to be held on an equal basis, which means one man, one vote. Every vote has the same weight. When I was still chair of the Electoral Council, I very often participated in international conferences. And we had an annual conference in Europe of what they call electoral management bodies. Responsible for managing elections in each and every national country. At one time, my Russian colleague told in the conference that he was of the opinion that intelligence was also very important for people for having access to the right to vote. And he said, only intelligent people should be able to. should be allowed to vote in elections. People with diplomas should be allowed to vote in elections. And there was an outcry in the room, of course, because this is not up to the international standards. They have to be universal, these elections. And it does not matter whether you're well educated or not. If you're of a certain age and you live in a certain country, then you have to be allowed to participate, you have the right to participate in elections. One further important thing is, of course, that the elections have to be free. And free means, in many cases, that there has to be a state neutrality. The state has to make sure that there is an equal level playing field for each and every party, each and every minority to participate in elections. And especially when it comes to access to the media, it's a very important issue, that there's equal access to the media for each and every party. That there's not a national broadcasting system that is only allowing the favorite parties to be shown on the TV or on the radio. Also when it comes to funding, equal level playing field. A lot of nations, a lot of states have a funding system for political parties. Just make sure that each and every party has a fair share of the funding for political parties. And in many countries, this is a huge problem. I see it in Eastern Europe, I see it in Africa, I see it in Asia, I see it also in other parts of the world, that when it comes to the state neutrality, there are a lot of problems. Because in many cases, the incumbents, the people that are already in office, they want to stay in office. And they use their position, the money, the governmental cars, the airplanes, the offices, etc., the governmental money, to stay in office. And a lot of extra effort goes also on an international level to creating an equal level playing field when it comes to elections. And when it comes to, for instance, international supervisory mechanisms, there are a lot of missions every now and then of international, with the composition from all countries of the world, or at least some countries of the world participating in these supervisory bodies. And their attention goes in a lot of cases to the state neutrality, to the free elections. Of course, the core principle for elections is that it has to be secret. Nobody has a right to know what you voted for. Not even your husband, nor your wife, nor your children. You're completely free in electing who you want. And especially one of the things that are of interest in many international documents is that there should be no family voting. There are many countries where the husband in a family says, well, give me your voting cards and I will vote for you. No? Or I decide for you how you vote and live up to my wishes. Otherwise there will be no meal for you this evening, things like that. No? Family voting is a big issue in many cases. Voting should also be direct. At least one of the chambers in Parliament should be elected directly by the people. And when there are representative bodies on a national or on a regional level, or on a municipal level, like you have in Indonesia, provinces and also regions, then you can also have a direct election. And you have to make sure that these elections take place on regular intervals, within a certain term, after a certain term of 4, 5, 6, 7 years, things like that. Make sure that there is a possibility to change the majority, and that you don't create a dictatorship. There is one principle there, perhaps, which I gave a question mark, which is integrity. And why the question mark? A year ago, I was talking to some people, also in this audience like this, and it was at another university, and somebody came up to me during the question time and said, yeah, well, you left out one important principle when it comes to elections. I said, well, amaze me, show me what went wrong. He said, yeah, well, integrity should be in there as well, as a core principle for the elections. And of course, he was right. But they said to him, well, integrity is not as such a principle only relevant for the elections. I think that integrity is a precondition for each and every governmental or administrative action. Integrity should be there in each and every situation, and not only during election time. So for me, it's of course integrity is of the utmost importance, but it is not a specific principle for elections. There should be integrity within the electoral system, of course, and the way supervisory body work, but it is not a specific principle for elections. Then, of course, the big issue arises when you have all these general principles, how you deal with them in real life. And that means for us as lawyers, of course, that you have to make these universal principles operational in your own constitutional and your own legal system. They are only general principles, and they have to be made concrete in law to become operational. And all kinds of issues have to be solved when you go, when you try to implement these universal principles. There are some issues on a fundamental level, on a constitutional level, one would say. For instance, you have to decide on your electoral system. Which will it be? Is it a system of proportional representation? Do you want to have a majoritarian system? Do you want to have districts? First past the post? There are all kinds of electoral systems out there, and you have to make a decision for yourself as a country, because there's no regulation on the international level that goes go and decide that for you. You have to decide it for yourself as a country, what kind of electoral system you want to have there. And it's so important, that electoral system, that in many cases it is placed in the Constitution. You have to make a decision on what electoral system you want to use. But also, of course, important is who has the right to vote, and who is eligible, who can become a member of the parliament or a municipal council or whatever. So these are some fundamental principles that you have to decide for yourself. And in many cases they are decided on the constitutional level. There are other issues as well, for instance, all kinds of practical issues. For instance, registration of voters. How do you organize that? How do you register political parties? What is a political party? Should there be some kind of an intra-party democracy? That there's a democracy within the party itself? Or can you allow parties to be only some kind of instrument for one or two persons with a lot of money? Do you want to have legislation on that as well? But also legislation on voting day. Who decides on which day voting will take place? All these kinds of issues you have to decide upon. And these are in many cases decided in acts of parliament, in all kinds of legislation. And the important question, I had to deal with the question many times also in the Netherlands, but also in other situations in Europe. On what level do you want to lay down all these regulations, all these decisions? And for us as lawyers, or lawyers to be, it's a very important issue, of course. What kind of legislation do you want? On what level do you want to organize all this? And in my view, and it's supported by a lot of courts in the world, you have to organize and you have to lay down all these decisions on the system, on the legislation, etc., on the highest level as possible. Not in the Constitution, because in many cases it's quite difficult to change the constitution. But make sure that Parliament is involved. Make sure that it's not only in governmental decrees or ministerial decrees or these types of legislation, because that makes them subject to instability. That politics gets involved. That the majority of a certain point in time is dominant in organizing these kind of things. And there are countries in the world where they change their electoral system after each and every election. Because the majority that has won the election wants to make sure that it stays in power in the next election. So they change the electoral law in a way that makes sure that they will be there in office after the next election as well. And one of the main standards by which we assess whether or not a democracy is stable and that you have a real, true democracy is by looking at the stability of the electoral law. If the electoral law is stable, it stays there for many years, then you really have to do with a stable democracy. So it's a very important thing. And then, of course, there's a lot of discussion always on who has to supervise these elections. KPU was already mentioned, but I understand correctly, in Indonesia you have at least 3 supervisory bodies when it comes to elections. You have the KPU, you have Bawaslu, and you have also the Ethics Commission, to some extent involved in deciding on all kinds of electoral matters. And I'm not going, of course, in discussion with you on all these Indonesian bodies, but the most important thing is that you have to decide as a country on how do you organize your supervisory system. And also, when there are electoral disputes, who's going, in the end, going to decide upon them? Do you have a constitutional court, an electoral tribunal? These kind of issues might arise. And there are a lot of questions to be dealt with. I'll give you some examples for each and every core principle that I showed on the screen. And I want you to know that, and I already mentioned that, by next week I will talk about dispute resolution within the really existing constitutional and legal framework. And today I will only deal with decisions that you have to make with regards to that framework. So, how do you implement that framework? Now, universal. All humans are human beings are equal, are able to participate in elections. Yeah. One of the core issues in many cases is, and you have to decide for yourself as a country, who has the right to vote? Only people that are living in your country and have your nationality, or, for instance, people with the nationality, your nationality, living abroad. In other countries, do they also have the right to vote? People living outside your country, do they have also the right to vote? And momentarily in Europe is a very big issue, because perhaps you're aware of the fact that in Turkey there's a big referendum coming up. They have to decide whether or not they change their constitution, and that constitution will give the current president, President Erdogan, much more power. But who is going to vote for that constitution? In Turkey, there's a strong belief that every Turkish national living outside Turkey is still part and parcel of the nation. And they have to decide. They have to be able to participate in these elections. And therefore, ministers of the Turkish government are traveling all over the world, but especially, of course, in Europe, in order to address Turkish people in, for instance, the Netherlands, in Germany, in other countries as well, to make sure that they vote in the next elections for the Turkish president and for the new constitution. So there's a very strong belief that the Turkish nationality as such is of predominance, and that creates the right to vote. But in other countries, they take a different approach. They say, well, only people living in a certain country are really capable, are aware of understanding what's going on in that country. They watch the news, they read the newspapers, they are capable of understanding what's going on in the country. And we only want these people to participate in elections. So there are countries where the electoral law says that there's no possibility for people living outside the country that know to vote in the elections. So that's also a possibility. And there is, in some countries quite a change going on, and a change in a way that makes citizenship more, it turns from nationality towards residence. People living in a certain place are allowed to participate in all kinds of issues. And like for instance in the Netherlands, it is possible for people who don't have the Dutch nationality, but who are living already in the Netherlands for 5 years, on a legal basis, mind you, they are legally there, they are allowed to participate in elections on a municipal level. Because they said, you pay taxes, you live in that neighborhood, you live in that municipality, so we allow you to participate in the elections as well. But the only one to say is, of course, that you have to make a decision on that. That's an important issue that you have to bring up. Then, there's the age question. In many countries, and it was the same case in a Euro country, I think, but also in the Netherlands, some decades ago, you had to be, for the Senate, 40 years of age, or 23 years of age for the second chamber, or whatsoever. Nowadays, in many countries, the age has been set on 18. Many countries, also in Indonesia, if you're 18 years of age, then you can vote for in elections. But nowadays, in some countries, there's a debate going on whether or not you should allow people of the age of 16 to participate in elections. We saw it, for instance, in Austria during the presidential elections. Austria has turned to the system. You see it. You saw it at the referendum for the Scottish independence from the UK. And quite recently, the European Parliament has said, well, we want to change the system as well. We want the youngsters from the age of 16 already to participate in elections, to vote in elections. And the rationale, the reason behind this is that there's a strong belief that if people are still of that young age, and they get all kinds of education at school on democracy and the rule of law, that are really very well into it, they're really in favor of democracy and rule of law, and if you allow them to participate in elections, then it's most likely that when they first turn out, that they will turn out the second time as well. You get educated in participating in elections, so to say. And then the strong idea is that if you allow people at a young age to participate in elections, that it will increase the turnout in later years as well. And why is the turnout so important? Well, in many cases, not only political scientists think this, but also politicians, they consider turnout, the level of turnout, as very important for the legitimacy of the system. If you have a high turnout in the elections, people are really into it and really support the system. At least that's a strong belief. Equal access to in elections. Yeah, well, you have to decide for yourself whether or not you want to have districts or not. And what is the size of the districts? If you have districts that are different in size, where people, for instance, one candidate in one district needs 10,000 votes, and in another district a candidate needs 30,000 votes, or even more, then you can really ask yourself whether or not it's still equal. There's one big issue there, and it's been there for centuries now. When it comes to districts, do you allow gerrymandering? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term, but gerrymandering means that it's a combination of the person who invented it, and it's about the salamander. What does it mean? Mr. Jerry, it was an American political scientist, saw that there in the United States, especially when it came to the elections for the House of Representatives, they were changing the borders of the districts all the time, in order to make sure that they had the right voters in the district, make sure that the candidate of a certain political party would be elected. And at one point he said, yeah, well, this district there's no reason behind it anymore, except only that it is only supporting people from the Republican Party, for instance, or the Democratic Party. And the district is, it has borders like a salamander, he said. And therefore they created the term gerrymandering, a combination of Jerry and salamander. And this is one of the reasons, at least a lot of my colleagues in the United States say, that it's at the moment very difficult for the Democratic Party in the United States to gain a majority in the House of Representatives. Because in the earlier days, when the Republicans were still in power, they changed the borders of a lot of districts in order to make sure that they would stay in power and that their candidates would have a better chance for the upcoming elections. So gerrymandering, the constant change of districts, borders, is also an important issue. And you have to decide in your own system, if you have a district system, if you want to have fixed borders or flexible borders that can be changed after each and every election. One other question that has to be decided upon is whether or not you reserve certain seats for certain parts of your voters. In Indonesia, there were reserved seats for the people of the military years ago. In New Zealand, they have reserved seats for minorities like the Maoris. In African countries, they have a lot of reserved seats for people, disabled people, female, people of with a certain minority. So there's a lot of possibility there to decide upon within your electoral system. Then decisions upon the free access, the state neutrality. A few words on that. In many countries there is a huge debate going on, and I'm sure that's also the case in Indonesia, which role media play in elections. President Trump considered them the enemy of the people. He rules the world by Twitter and social media. But in many other countries, the ordinary media, television, radio, are still important. And then the important question is, of course, well, how do you deal with the media? And there are some important ideas there, because, for instance, there's a code of conduct of electoral matters. An international standard that says here, well, reporting by state-owned media has to be balanced and impartial. And there is even a positive obligation for the state to create a level playing field. And then you have to decide upon the setting up a legal framework guaranteeing the media to work freely, that they can go everywhere. That you have equal access as a political party to all this media. And that state media should report without bias. Let me stress this, I'm not talking about the commercial media. Commercial media can do whatever they please. At least in many countries can do whatever they please. I'm dealing with the publicly financed media. Then another important issue is the secrecy of the vote. When we talk about the secrecy of the vote, in many cases, the core thing is, of course, that nobody is allowed to know how you vote, for whom you vote. That's the core thing about the secrecy of the ballot. But you can also, you have also decide on whether or not the voting is compulsory. Is it obliged to vote? Like it, for instance, is in Australia or in Belgium. If you don't go to the polling booth, you have to pay fines. Do you want to have such a system? And of course, it is motivated by this idea that it promotes turnout, and a higher turnout creates more legitimacy for the representative body. But do you really want to have the compulsory voting? And in the Netherlands, for instance, we don't have such a thing. We have a right to vote, but there's no obligation to vote. And I was, some minutes ago, I was referring to my Russian colleague as chair of the Electoral Council, and we once had a debate, also during one of these meetings of the electoral management bodies, whether or not the KPU, the Electoral Council, should also be responsible for all kinds of advertisements to create a better turnout in elections. And I said, I'm completely against it. There's a right to vote, but there's also a right not to vote. And he said, yeah, well, I as a KPU, I as a president of the Russian KPU, are responsible for increasing turnout. And the wonderful thing was, that was not that wonderful, Mr. Izel knows the story already, that at that time he was responsible for conducting or for running the presidential elections some years ago. And they had 3 candidates in the presidential elections. It was Mr. Putin, Mr. Putin, and Mr. Putin. And he was responsible for increasing the turnout. So he was only busy with increasing the legitimacy of the election of Mr. Putin as president. And said, of course, yeah, well, I don't want to be responsible in that kind of system for increasing the turnout. So compulsory voting could be an idea, but yeah, you have to decide for yourself. And there are some countries that also debate on, are people allowed to know how you voted? And for instance, in some countries, they have a very rudimentary system where you have to put your finger on in ink, for instance, to make sure that you vote only one time. Yeah. But everybody can see that you went to the polling booth. In some countries, there are lists with the voters for a certain polling booth. Like we have in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, in Curaçao and Aruba, still part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They have a list there in the polling booth, and they know, yeah, Mr. Rizal and me, etc., is going to vote in that polling booth. And the candidates of all these parties are sitting there with their pencils and say, wait, he's not there already. Let's take a car, let's take a bicycle, make sure that he comes to the polling booth and votes for me. So, secrecy to vote, also an important thing. Can be an important thing as well. But you have to decide in your own system how do you deal with these kind of issues. Direct elections, also important. As I already said, at least one of the chambers of the parliament, if you have a bicameral system of course, has to be directly elected. And why? Well, that's the important thing is, of course, is a core principle of electoral systems. And that chamber automatically has more legitimacy, because, as I said, we started off with that, the sovereignty lies in the people. And if the people decides directly on the composition of a certain chamber, part of the parliament, then it's the more legitimate part of the parliament. But if you have a bicameral system, then you have to decide upon which electoral system you're going to use for that other chamber. Are you going elected directly as well? And then, of course, you can have some kind of a confusion, which is the most important chamber. Do you elect them through municipal councillors or provincial councillors? Who's responsible for the election? And for instance, if you make provincial councillors responsible for the composition of the Senate, You have some kind of a Senate here as well in Indonesia. What does it mean for the position of that Senate? Are they simply representatives for the provinces? Do they have to stand for the problems of the provinces? Or are they there for the entire country as well? It causes interesting debates. But at least you have to decide. And of course, you have to create elections or have elections on with regular intervals. And all over the world there are differences. For instance, in the House of Representatives is elected in the United States of America is elected for each 2 years. And yeah, well, it's a very nervous system, of course. All these members of the House of Representatives are on a permanent campaign. They're always in their home state, they're always campaigning for the next elections. And they're hardly ever in Washington, except when they want to turn out Obamacare, and they don't succeed. What a failure it was. No, we're not going to come. But in many cases, when it comes to the regular intervals, we have 4 or 5 years. There were some, for instance, in France, they had presidential elections, and they had a term for 7 years, but they changed it to 5 years because they considered the term of 7 years far too long. Then I will say briefly something about the electoral dispute problems. And the EDR, the guiding principles in electoral dispute resolution. There are some important principles there which stem from international standards, and I think that in many cases, also in Indonesia, also in the Netherlands, we live up to these standards. Of course, there has to be, and that's some debate also in the newspapers in Indonesia momentarily when it comes to the position of KPU, and I saw it in Jakarta Post just 2 days ago, is the electoral dispute resolving body, EDRB stands for Electoral Dispute Resolving Body, is it really independent or not? Should it be independent or not? And in the view of many, it really should be independent. It's because otherwise politics gets involved and politicians decide on the outcome of elections. And yeah, well, what do you have? What do you get when politicians decide themselves on the outcome of the elections? You can create tremendous difficulties. Of course, there should be clarity about the independence and also the impartiality of the members of that body. There should be no debate, they have it again, on the integrity or the professionalism of the members of that body. They should be educated and really dealing with all these issues. They have to be accountable and liable for the things that they do, and can be held accountable for what they're doing. And there is this issue of financial sustainability. Means that there should be enough finances there for this body to do its work. And there are some countries where the lack of finances are really terrible when it comes to the quality of the work the body can deliver. But there are also countries where the body is only created for a certain period of time, and then really there's no money anymore, and it goes away. When it comes to all kinds of systems for electoral dispute resolution, you have certain systems there all over the world that deal with all these kinds of problems. There are still some countries where, in the end, the legislative body or the political assembly decides on the most important electoral disputes. And you see it in some old countries in Europe, mainly. We have it in France, in the UK, and we have it also to some extent in the Netherlands. And that's from an old theory that says that when it comes to the separation of powers, the judiciary should not be involved in politics. And in these countries, at least from an old tradition, a lot of these electoral disputes are considered to be of a democratic nature. I will explain that later on. I will explain that later in the coming week. You have also countries where judicial bodies are responsible for solving problems, and also systems where electoral management bodies are there, like KPU or Bawaslu, and they have some judicial powers that we have to decide on these things. And then it's the odd one out. You don't have that many anymore. There are some countries that still have ad hoc bodies, just incidental bodies solving all these issues. And then one of the big issues is, if you have a judicial body who's responsible for solving these electoral system problems, what kind of judicial body do you want to have? In some countries, there are regular courts that decide on these issues. And the benefit of that is, of course, that there are less costs because it's already there, a regular court, ordinary court. But it is not specialized, that's the downside of it. And in many cases, it creates an extra caseload for these courts. And in many cases, courts are already loaded with cases. So, and if you have a lot of electoral disputes, then it could be a problem. In some countries, constitutional courts decide upon electoral disputes. Like for instance in Indonesia. And on the one hand, you have this great benefit of having a very respected body of high esteem, a court of high esteem that's solving all these problems. But the downside of it, and the negative side could be, in some countries at least it is a negative side, that the constitutional court, which there should be no debate about its independence and impartiality, gets involved in all kinds of political debates, of course. The political parties are battling each other on that seat, on these seats, on the majority, etc., etc. And then the constitutional court comes in, and whether or not it's independent or not, immediately political parties drag the constitutional court in politics as well. So it can also be a problem for the position of the constitutional court when it has to decide on all these electoral matters. So in some countries they have another system, like for instance in the Netherlands, we have the administrative court to decide on the electoral matters. And we do that in the Netherlands because we consider, and many countries do this at the same time, the similarity, because it reflects the nature of the electoral. It's of a more administrative nature. It's administrative decisions made by administrative bodies, and you have to decide upon them. And in many cases, the wonderful thing of administrative courts is that they have their own proceedings, and they can act very quick, can act very fast in all kinds of issues. So timeliness is one beneficial thing. And then you have countries where they have specialized courts, specialized electoral courts, like they have, for instance, in Brazil. And they have a Tribunal Electoral, which is responsible for dealing with more than 10,000 cases each year when it comes to the electoral disputes. Electoral disputes on the lowest level, municipal level, provincial levels, also on the national level. There are a lot of electoral disputes. And such a special tribunal could be very helpful when it comes to situations where you have a lot of electoral disputes to deal with. But the problem can also be, of course, an extra court means extra costs. And also lead to all kinds of political appointments, because if that's the court that really solves your electoral disputes, then for certain political parties, especially the ruling political parties, it can be very interesting to appoint and make sure that the only judges are being appointed that are of their color, adhere to their political system. This was just briefly how to deal with electoral disputes, and I use it more or less as a cliffhanger for the things that are going to be discussed next week. And so by now, I thank you very much for your attention, and I will answer all your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for Professor Henk for interesting lecture about the principle of election. And then I give, for first session, I give 3 questions from the student. And if you want to give a question, you may use English language, or whether you can use Indonesian language, is okay. And then I'll try to explain it to Professor Henk. So, if you want to ask, please raise your hand. Okay, 2 from this side, and then from international class, Arara? None? Okay. So 3 questions would be 2 from regular. You can come forward, and then 1 from regular. Okay, you can come forward.
These are the daredevils, the heroes of the audience. Welcome.
Thank you so much for this chance. My name is Yendias Montega. So Professor, I have 2 questions. First of all, upon the core principle of equal political rights and upon the assertion of freedom of expression, I know that the right is protected in ICCPR, but my question is, should people behind bars, for example inmates, be allowed to vote? Because I think that they actually have an access to news, for example, they actually have voices to be heard. And in some cases, for example, countries in Australia, they actually allow these inmates to vote. But I think in my country it's not legalized yet, so I want to ask upon that question. Now the second question, it will be about the recent election in the United States. So we know that Hillary Clinton lost the electoral vote, but like what I heard, she won the popular vote, right? So my question is, what precisely is the legitimacy of the electoral vote? Why does it exist to begin with? Thank you so much for the chance. Hope you can. Thank you so much for the chance. Thank you.
My name is Michael Amos, and I'm from a regular class. My question concerns the separation of church and state. I know that one of the common principles of constitutional law that you said is the separation of church and state, and that law reflects the will of people and not God. But how about some constitutions that allows and even mandates religion inside that state? For example, I mentioned 2 constitutions, one from Indonesia and one from America even. The Indonesian constitution mentions God inside it's one of its clauses, and even the American Declaration of Independence mentions God inside their clause. And does that mean that that country that mentions God or mandates religion says God inside their constitution or Declaration of Independence is not secular? Or since I have seen that in both cases, in both countries, it is argued by some people that because in that constitution it mentions God in America and in Indonesia, that means that religion inside that country is mandated by and should be allowed by that country. Or would you say that those countries, America and Indonesia, is secular in nature? Thank you.
Good morning, sir. I would like to ask a question regarding the freedom of press within the election. We could see that the recent U.S. elections and the elections in Indonesia 3 years ago, in 2014, has displayed a great game between TV stations and the media, which has mostly misled a lot of people into electing first and second candidates for the election. we've seen this phenomenon go on and on in a lot of countries, and maybe as it's practically it has misled a lot of people in voting, the first or second candidate, third candidate. Should it be regulated? I do not in any way disagree with the freedom of press and the freedom of speech, but when it has misled, isn't that the same thing as propaganda? Thank you, sir.
Give applause for our three friends. You can answer as whatever you like.
Thank you very much for these questions. They're very interesting and also very difficult to answer. But first, the question about the inmates. I think that in many cases, inmates are just voters behind bars. And there's a lot of debate also went on in Europe for some time, whether or not, like they did in the UK, you could prohibit on a general basis each and every inmate the right to vote and deny the right to vote. And there's a famous case of the European Court in Strasbourg. It's a human rights court in Europe. The Hearst case. It was about the United Kingdom, and it said that you can't deny on a general basis the voting rights of inmates. They are still citizens, and you have to be very specific in motivating whether or not you allow inmates to vote in elections or not, or deny the voting rights. And like for instance in the Netherlands, each and every inmate has the right to vote, except in the cases where there is a court ruling that you are no longer allowed to participate in elections. And it's only there in cases where there's a severe punishment for instance, threatening the democracy. That you're not capable of, you do not earn anymore the right to participate in the democracy. So in general, I would say that inmates should at least have the possibility to vote in the elections. And you can do that, for instance, by postal voting or voting by proxy, or you can even have polling booths in prisons, like we have in the Netherlands and other countries as well. So there is no justification to prohibit in general people behind bars to participate in elections. They are still citizens of the country. Yeah?
Then, the wonderful question about the popular vote and the electoral vote.
It's a very difficult one, and I must say, and you know that of course because you're familiar with the system, that Mr. Trump, up until today, is still not convinced that he did not want the popular vote. He still says that there is a lot of fraud there, and there were a lot of problems with the voting machines, or there were other things going on, and that's the reason why that he didn't want the popular vote. That says something about this idea about legitimacy. Yeah? The popular vote is the most important vote in many cases, one would say. But yeah, well, the fact that there is a difference between the popular vote and the electoral vote, that's due to the creation of their own electoral system. You see in a lot of systems with a majority, with majoritarian votes, like first past the post in the UK, you have the same idea. You can have situations also in the UK, for instance, that, for instance, the Conservatives, the Tories, have the majority of the seats because they won their seats with a relative majority within their districts. But if you count all the votes over the entire country, and perhaps the Labour Party or the Liberal Party would have the most votes. So that's all due to the electoral system that has been set up. And yeah, well, in the United States, it's a very old system with all kinds of old tricks in it, so to say.
And indeed, there's a debate going on in the United States of America whether or not they should change it. Because, yeah, well, it's just creates a strange thing that you have a president that has not won the popular vote, but still the president of the United States. That's an important position. But it's all due to the electoral system that makes it more important, what I said, in a country you have to decide for yourself how to deal with these universal principles. Then a very difficult question about the separation of church and state. But I can answer it in a very easy way, I would say. There is no doubt, at least when it comes to the majority of the scholars in the United States of America, and also in the constitutional law of America, that the United States is a secular state. There is a reference to God in its constitution, like you have a reference to God in the constitution in Indonesia. But it simply says something about your sources of inspiration. We are inspired by the Bible. We are inspired by the Quran. But other countries are inspired by other things, like human rights, or this idea that all human rights, all people are equal. So the fact that Allah or God or whatever religious belief is being expressed in the Constitution does not mean that in the end the Constitution is a religious one. If you look at the Constitution of also of Indonesia, but also the United States, there are a lot of provisions in there making sure that all religious beliefs, all minorities in the country have access to the political system, have access to the governmental system, etc., etc. And there is no predominance of what political party whatsoever. So the best way of answering is this: that the reference to God in the Constitution does not mean that's per se a theocratic state. It's a secular state. And although you have, one might call religious fanatics who read more in the Constitution than other people will do, it makes no difference, and I think that the Constitutional Court has a lot to say about that. Then the freedom of the press. Yeah. Media is a tremendous source of debate, confusion, in each and every election. Also in the Netherlands. All new political parties want to have their time and their minutes on TV. And as a state TV, it allowed them to participate, to give this extra minutes. But there are also commercial stations there, giving all the information. It is tremendously difficult to regulate the free press, because immediately you get to the core of the free press. And you can have all kinds of regulations about, for instance, criminal law, but also administrative law, making sure that these commercial TV stations live up to certain standards. If they give misleading information, perhaps you can criminalize them. Could be a case. Prohibited entirely? I don't think so. The strong belief still is, and it is still the strong belief also in the United States, that a democracy should be self-cleansing. It should clean itself. It should create countervailing powers. And what we see, for instance, in the United States momentarily, is that the media, a lot of newspapers, a lot of new TV stations, found new ways of dealing with the presidency of Mr. Trump. And the media, and the way he deals with the media, there is some people, you can say, there is a blessing in disguise there, that President Trump has been elected. I'm not one of them, but some of the journalists say that. A blessing in disguise there, because under Obama, but also under the former presidents, the media and the politicians were very close to each other. They sat on each other's chair every now and then, as they speak. They say, well, we have to be more impartial, we have to go more independent, we have to be more fact-checking. We have to stay away from these political offices and do our reporting. Stay to the facts, and not as the facts as the president or as the party is intended. So, yes, you can create some regulation, criminal law, for instance, administrative law, but you have to be very careful doing that. Yeah, well, and let democracy and the free press do its work. In the end, there's a strong belief that it will clean itself up, the act. But yeah, well, for the short term, we end up with a president that hardly everybody wants it.
For the time, Professor, I'd like to ask one question. So, when in a country, say, there are multiple legal systems coexisting, and say there are certain communities, say tribal people, that are allowed to implement their own legal system. In your own personal opinion, should they be granted right to vote? And say they did not vote, would it harm a part of democracy in the country or not? Say this country has this democracy of letting people, whether they would like to vote or not, they have the right to do so. But then, in these tribal peoples, they implement their own legal system. So basically, they do have legal documents as a part of that country, but then they have their own legal structures in their own communities. So basically, they do not follow national legal system in their daily lives. Should they be granted a right to vote? And if they are granted such right to vote, and say they did not vote, would it harm the democracy in the country? Thank you.
Thanks for the you mentioned earlier that it involves majority rule in democracy, which is why elections are held in the first place. You also mentioned how majority rule should not mean it will lead to majoritarian dictatorship that I conclude as populism, just like what happens in Venezuela right now. So my question is, what is the ideal situation for democracy to be held as well as how it was implemented in the Greek century, the Greek history, how it's made to achieve the goal that it was held in the first place.
Good morning, sir. I'm so honored to be able to ask you this question. I'm Yasmin. What I want to know is the freedom of, regarding the freedom of press. In the Trump election period, it seems that the media are actually covering the controversy that comes out of his policies. So, what I want to ask, isn't it more because of his controversial policies and executive orders that the media are seen to, cover only facts that are not true, says Trump? And then, do you think that it is rooting more about the Trump and his controversial decisions? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, ladies. And then,
thank you very much. Very intriguing questions once again. From the female part of the audience. The first question about the legal systems, and if I understand correctly, and if I translate it in my own terms, you have in a lot of countries you have minorities who are living by customary law. Adelrecht, for instance, adelrecht. Yeah, okay, that's legal pluralism. And the country where I also am a professor in South Africa, they have even recognized customary law also as such in their constitution. The fact that there is a role for customary law in the constitution or in the legal system does not say in the end that customary law is dominant or is predominant even. It has, in many cases, because it is part of the Constitution, it has to a certain extent live by the limitations that are also given by the Constitution. They cannot live outside the Constitution within such a system. They have some leeway, some freedom to act on their own positions, to have a chief, for instance, in a village, and they have their own way of dealing with disputes. But they are not allowed to infringe upon constitutional rights, for instance. For instance, when I look at South Africa, there are situations where customary law does not allow women to have permits, or to have houses, to have possessions, etc. Yeah, well, if the Constitution says that men and women are equal, and it's simply, if there's a dispute there, then you can not solve it in the end by customary law. The Constitution has to be upheld. So, and it always creates a tension. And there's always this idea that in the end everybody has to live up to the standards of the Constitution and up to the legal system, and for the time being we let the people act conform the constitutional law, or the customary law. But whenever a dispute arises in the end, I think within the constitutional system it's hardly permissible that you don't apply the constitutional standards in many cases. And voting rights, yeah, well, they have the right to vote. They are not obliged to vote. There's no obligation to vote. And if they don't vote, yeah, well, it's up to them. They had their chance and they didn't use it. So in my view, it creates no debate about the legitimacy of the electoral system as such, or the representative body as such. Because each and every one, also these people have the access to parliament, the right to vote for parliament or for the municipal country. And if they don't use that right, yeah, well, it's up to them. That's also part of a democracy. Coming to the question on what's an ideal democracy. Well, the wonderful thing is that in a democracy we will always be debating what is the ideal democracy. That's the core issue of democracy. It gives us the freedom but also the necessity to debate the way we deal with democracy. And as such, there is no ideal democracy, except for one thing that I wanted to say, is that one of the major issues of democracy is, of course, the thing that I mentioned, that elections should be held at regular intervals. The main thing about democracy is that there can be a change of power. there has to be a change of power every now and then, but it is a possibility for a change of power. And the thing that we had in Venezuela, for instance, with Mr. Chavez or Mr. Maduro momentarily, is that they want to stay in power and do everything to stay in their position. And that's not true democracy. There are all these other principles as well. But the fact that there's an alternation of power each and every now and then, that is the core essence of democracy. And and that's the wonderful thing of democracy. We'll debate it to the end of the days. And that's been said that there's democracy is not perfect, but it's the best system we have. Is what said Churchill. Then the press and the decisions of Mr. Trump. I think, if I understand you correctly, I think that you're quite right. The press is debating Trump most of all, as is the majority of the press, because of his decisions. They're bad. They're not in line with the Constitution. They're not in line with international law. So yeah, well, you have to debate that. But the most dominant thing about Mr. Trump, and that's comparable to what's happening in other countries as well, he's the so-called populist politician. You have populist political parties. And the key element of populist parties and populist politicians is that they strongly believe that they are the real persons, they are the real parties that really, truly represent the will of the people. And that all these other parties, all these governmental institutions, but all other institutions as well, like the media, are simply the establishment. They are the elite. They are standing in the way of the people. They are the enemies of the people. And these types of terms, they are referring to the press and to the other parties as well. So, in his mind, and this is mind of also other populist people as well. You have Mr. Wilders in the Netherlands, you have Mrs. Le Pen in France. They are the two representatives of the people, and the others, they stand in their way, and that's also their way of dealing with the critique of the press. So yeah, well, I'm elected by the people. The elite, the press has nothing to do with them. So he gets only angry with them because they stand in his way. Yeah, there's some media that indeed he's in front of some of the media, yeah, which is Fox, of course, and some other Breitbart and all these other media. Yeah, well, I think that's to a large extent a reflection of the problem. In my view, and I think that's not only my view, but also the view of many constitutional lawyers, people who are in an important office, the presidency, or they are in parliament, etc., they have to live up to the standards that are being laid down in the Constitution. They have to live up to the standards of the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and they should welcome any critique, because they are part of the democracy that they are representing. So, well, it's more or less let's say, the incapability of a certain president to deal with the democracy and the rule of law that's showing now, then there's a true problem with the constitutional system as such. So thank you.
And then I just want to remind you that next week we still have this session with Professor Henk. So please come punctual at 8, especially for parallel. It's not in your time, but you have to attend at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then if you want to join for another lecture, we have some other lecture in Salemba in Master Sarjana if you want to join, and then you can see the poster about the time and the topics. And then give big applause once more for the and then it's very pleased to have you here, students. Thank you very much. Good morning. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.